Hello everyone. On behalf of the Center for Human Rights and Environmental Studies, Ramanujan College, I welcome you all to this UGC-sponsored online 3-month executive development program on human rights. I am Dr. Sreeparna Bhattacharjee and I teach education in the Department of Education, Assam University, Silchar. Today, I will be discussing with you the topic Human Rights Movements in India, contemplating the role of democratic state and civil society. Before I start the lecture, I would like to give you a brief introduction about the importance of human rights and the human rights movements in global as well as in Indian context. Whenever we talk about human rights, it speaks volume about the rights as well as the kind of claims that we human beings are entitled to. And these rights are bestowed upon us sometimes by the nature and by society as well. But we have seen, or the human civilization has witnessed, on various occasions, several violations due to the social phenomena like social exploitation, war, and many such other occurrences. As a result, it is really very, very pertinent to think about what are these human rights and why human rights movements are at all organized or it takes place. Because movements refers to the integrated effort of people to change something, or we can say that it is a change for the betterment of the society. Movement has also certain aims and objectives, and to fulfill those aims and objectives, group of people struggle and ultimately they are able to fulfill those aims and objectives. So it's very important to understand the significance of human rights movements in Indian context because we know that India is a land of diversity. We represent multiculturalism, and as a result, different groups are having different value system, different cultural characteristics, all those are having some kind of uniqueness. And sometimes we find that the issues related to the integration or belongingness to the nation has some kind of dichotomy. And as a result, it is really very essential to think about the evolution and the kind of movements that have taken place as far as human rights are concerned, as well as still we can witness, and maybe in future also we will witness this human rights movements until and unless the human civilization is in existence. So, the title of today's lecture is Human Rights Movements in India Contemplating the Role of Democratic State and Society. So, here actually we would try to look into how the human rights movements have been shaped by people's movement, because democracy is a form of government which is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And as a result, it is really very, very important to understand what role democracy plays, as well as what is the role of civil society. What is the meaning of civil society, and what is the role of democratic state that we will be discussing in our subsequent sections. So, with this prelude, I am starting today's lecture. So, here in the introduction, you can see that a brief background about rights have been mentioned. When we talk about human rights, the first thing that comes into our mind is that what are rights? We know that rights are certain claims, rights are certain entitlements, and we know that some rights are prerequisites for our survival. We cannot survive without those basic rights, or we can say that these are the basic amenities without which human beings cannot survive. So, as I already told you, that some of the rights are natural rights and some of the rights are social, cultural, and political in nature. So, the natural rights are those rights which are given to us or which are bestowed upon us by nature. And those rights are essential for, or we can say that these are the preliminary conditions for our survival. And these are the basic conditions without which human existence will be impossible. Whereas we also find that there are certain rights which have been given to us or which we are enjoying or which we are entitled to because we are the social member or we are the part of the society. So, both these types of rights, if we just differentiate or if we try to divide rights into natural rights and social rights, we find that both these rights are important. We cannot simply say that only the natural rights are sufficient for our life. It's not like that, because ultimately we are the social uh, animal, and we cannot think about uh, our existence in this society without social rights. These are very, very important. So both these rights are important, and for the entitlement, or as these rights are our claims, the movements for human rights are also being in existence. So, rights, though they are bestowed or endowed upon us, sometimes we find that there are some kind of uh, cases where these rights are being violated, or we can say that rights are being taken away. So these are the conditions which result into some kind of struggle. So here you can find that human rights have been defined, that it belongs to all, okay, regardless of their nationality, domicile, gender identity, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. It is a very, very natural, and we can say that a very, very fundamental principle for our existence. That is why it is really important to reflect upon what are these human rights and why there should be an integrated approach towards human rights, why movements are essential, why we should stand for human rights, and why this social collectivism is important. These are the driving force actually for any movement. And as I have already shared the views that movement has certain intention, or it has certain definite objectives or cause, and to achieve that we are having any kind of struggle in our society. So here you can find, I think all of you have got some idea about what are human rights in your previous classes. So here I am just providing you a basic notion of human rights and fundamental freedoms or fundamental rights. So what are human rights and what are fundamental rights? When we talk about human rights, these are the general rights. As I said, that it may be natural rights, it may be social rights, it may be political rights, or it may be cultural rights. On the other hand, fundamental rights are those rights which are granted to us by the Constitution. These are the rights which are sanctioned by the law. And for the violation of these rights, we can go to the court or to the judiciary. So here we have to understand that all human rights are not fundamental rights, because the area of human rights is much more broader. And the fundamental rights are those rights which have been considered the prerequisites for any individual. So here you can see that human rights, how human rights or what are human rights have been tried to be explained in the diagrammatic representation, like protect the individual at times in war and peace alike, individual and state, and can be international or regional. Means it's not that human rights is a matter of discussion only at the global level. It is a matter of discussion also at the center as well as at the peripheral level, which is very, very important. And fundamental rights, we know that our constitution has given us six fundamental rights, though originally we had another one, that is right to property, which has been you know amended and abolished or has been omitted from this section. And this fundamental right speaks volume about India's commitment or our nation's commitment to flourish democracy or to make it a people centric system. Right to equality, right to freedom, right against exploitation, cultural and educational rights, right to freedom of religion, and right to constitutional remedies. All these are the rights that speaks about or that elucidates how the nation has been from its inception striving for people's uh, rights and people's entitlements. Okay, so there is always a kind of, in the democracy, there is always a kind of tendency to make the system oriented towards the people and to make it a system where everyone can take part and everyone can achieve whatever is you know entitled to him or her. So here, in this slide, a brief background about the emergence of human rights at the global level have been provided. We know that human rights as a concept, though it is something that was natural or that is natural, but if we try to think about the evolution of human rights at the institutional level or the institutionalization of human rights, then we can say that the both world wars have played a very, very significant role. Okay, after the First World War, the League of Nations have been established. Okay, and when the Second World War broke out and the kind of distraction that had taken place at that time, and humanity was something that was at stake at that moment. So at that point of time only, the United Nations organization was established, and soon after that, in the year 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was made. And this UDHR is something that is known as the, uh, the final document on human rights. And this UDHR is something that acts as the guideline, or we can say that it is something, a document which is being referred and which has influenced many democracy in the late 50s to adopt a people centric government or democracy, because all those nations were under the subjugation of colonial rule, most of the nations at that point of time. And they could attain the freedom because of certain movements. and they understood that how rights are important. That is why when this UDHR was adopted, you can find that if you go through the provisions of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, many of this have been incorporated in the form of the fundamental rights. So this is indeed a very, very important step, or we can say that UDHR itself is a result of a movement, the movement for peace, the movement for tranquility at the global level, because of the kind of torture, because of the kind of violence that humanity witnessed during this World War period. People then understood that there is a need to have, or there is a need to exist peacefully. Humanity deserves that. So, as a result, we can say that there was a huge demand on the part of human civilization for a kind of conceptual framework, or we can say the legal institutional framework for human rights, and that has been provided by the UDHR. So now I will move into the genesis of human rights in Indian context, because this is our topic. We have to discuss about human rights movements in Indian context. Okay. So here you can see that when we talk about human rights in Indian context, if you go for any review, or if you just go through, or if you are going through any kind of literature, then you will find that there are certain explanation that how the concepts of rights have been embodied into this Indian context in the ancient time, in the medieval time, as well as in the uh, modern period. But here I have divided the evolution of human rights into two phases, that is the pre independence and the post independence period. And if you see that, or if you closely analyze the nature of these movements, you will find that these are contrasting, means these are completely different. Okay, because if we see the colonial India or the pre-independence period, we will find that the major intention, okay, for all movements, or we can say the major goals of all movements have been to attain freedom, or there was a demand for self-determination. Here I would like to explain self-determination. It refers to a person's right in political, social, cultural aspects where that person is free. It's not under any control. So, this self determination is something that has been put forward as a demand during this struggle for independence. We know that this struggle for independence had certain phases. It started with the Sepoy Mutiny, because Sepoy Mutiny is known as something, the first war of independence, and it was something that was an we can say that outrage against the exploitation, or the kind of dominance that was prevalent at that point of time. But the organized movement for independence started only uh, during the 19th century, because of the emergence of leaders, and they brought with them certain movements. Okay, and those movements like non-cooperation movement, and whether it may be the demand for Swaraj. Okay, so all speaks about our right to self-determination, our right to independence, okay, from any kind of alien rule. So that was the kind of we can say the intention, or that was the kind of demand at that point of time. In the post independence era, we find that the nature of human rights movement was something very different. Now it was based on how to, increase inclusion. Okay, because we know that India was not only under the foreign domain. India was under the domain of superstition, social stigma, social stratification. So these were, some of the staunch human rights violation cases in India, because of the kind of caste system that is prevalent in our society. So that is why I said that, it's very interesting to study about the human rights movement in Indian context, because here we not only find that these movements are for some kind of political demand. It is something that is also uh, directed towards removing all kinds of uh, social differentiation and all that. So, when this independent movement was at its peak, there was also a demand for a kind of system that will assure equality to all, okay, and that will help in removing the kind of barriers or the kind of restrictions that were put on a particular community or a particular group of people. So here we find that the movement, maybe it may be through the framing of the constitution, because it has been a result of so many years of uh, we can say that researches, so many years of involvement by people from different fields, and they could understand that this constitution is something that can act as the guideline for all, and it will direct the government to take steps, okay, for those who have been historically deprived. Okay, so if we see the framing of the constitution, here also we can find that the movement is involved, or there is a kind of struggle, there is a kind of attitude to change, because movement brings, when we talk about movement, it means what? It means that we are moving, we are changing. So this constitution, framing of the constitution, drafting of the constitution was a kind of movement. It was not something that came suddenly, or it's a result of, or it's a matter of a day. It is something that have been done, or it has been constructed, bit by bit. So that is why it's very interesting to understand the development of human rights, or we can say that how the concept of human rights evolved in Indian context in the pre-independence as well as in the post-independence era. So now we have come directly to our point, that is human rights movements and the contribution of the subaltern groups. As I have already told you that when we talk about human rights movements in Indian context, it is slightly different because of the kind of nature or the kind of social structure or social setup that we have. And we know that it is a land, or it is a place where it is being resided by so many subaltern groups. Now, what is the subaltern groups? This subaltern groups, this terminology refers to people who are completely isolated, who are not at all, coming under any kind of enlightenment, okay, and they are secluded. They are not considered a part of society. It may be the social reason, the political reason, or the geographical reason. And in the social hierarchy, they are at the bottom. And this particular kind of terminology has been put forward by sociologist and thinker Antonio Gramsci. He coined the word subaltern. And this has been applied in Indian parlance because of the diversity that exists in Indian social system. And there have been so many studies and all that. So the term subaltern groups have been or has been taken here or has been applied here to refer to people who are, as I said, historically deprived, or who are completely isolated, who have suffered centuries old system, and they were denied all kinds of rights. And it is also not the case that they have not reciprocated or they have not expressed their kind of resentment or something. It has taken place, and people have come forward from their community also. If we talk about their movement actually was in existence even before independence. Maybe it was not that organized, but it was in existence. That is why we find that some of the people from that particular or socially vulnerable group could make it, to the center. We can talk about Jyotiba Phule, we can talk about Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar. They are the examples of this kind of, you know, we can say that torch bearer of that struggle. So here the term subaltern groups has been used to refer to those group of peoples or those groups of in our society. It may be they may belong to some ethnic minority. There may be tribals and the indigenous community. So their right was something, and we can say that there is a continuous, urge for their upgradation. People are from civil society are taking up the issue, and the things are being done. So here we find that there has been a movement for their upgradation by people from different fields, and ultimately, in the constitution, these rights have been incorporated for their upgradation. So it's the human rights movement at the initial stage, we can say, and that movement actually resulted into the incorporation of a people oriented constitution where people have been granted educational and cultural rights, the social, economic, political, and other kinds of rights. And these are irrespective of our caste, creed, and any other background. And here also you can see that there are certain other articles which speaks about the rights of the indigenous and the subaltern groups. These are also mentioned. So it's very important why this particular you know point has been included here. The reason is that it has given a new dimension to the idea of human rights movements in India, because though this subalternity is something that has been coined by someone from outside, but this is very very relevant in Indian context, because the fight, as I said, was not only for political freedom. The fight was for social, economic, as well as cultural freedom. So that is why it's very, and we find so many people from indigenous community who also fought for their rights, or we can say that they also participated in the movement for freedom. And even later on also were they continued their fight because of they wanted to mainstream that particular group or mainstreaming the group. So that is why it's a very very important point. Here you can see this slide speaks about Indian freedom struggle as the bedrock of human rights movement. Here you see, when we talk about Indian freedom struggle, it is something, or it is referred, at many documents, and it is we can say that it is a frame for of reference, okay, in the arena of human rights, because the freedom struggle was itself a movement for human rights, okay, because this freedom struggle was a people's movement. It was a movement for our rights. It was a movement, okay, to fight for equality, justice, freedom of all kinds, because we were reduced to the status of subjects, or the people in India were reduced to the, their status was that of uh, someone who is very, very uh, secondary, or someone that who was not having any rights or anything. And it was a kind of, we can say that rule based on racism, okay, or we can say that there was a kind of uh, the feeling or the kind of notion of ethnic superiority, okay. So whatever movements have been initiated abroad also, we can say that we can refer to the movement in America, okay, which was an anti-racist movement. And even today, these movements, as I said, that movements cannot stop until and unless human civilization is in existence. Movements cannot be. We cannot say that movements are over. Even maybe now also we see there are cases where people from, the ethnic minority group, or racially those who are considered subordinate, they are struggling, or there are cases of violation of rights. So in Indian context also, this freedom movement was something which was the bedrock of uh, this kind of a struggle for human existence or human rights movement. Why it has been referred as the bedrock? Because we find that the demand for Swaraj was put forward during this struggle. We also find that this struggle was based on the notion or the values of nonviolence, a principle or a concept, or a we can say nonviolence is a way of life that has been later recognized by the international bodies. So, these are actually some of the important aspects that help us in understanding that how this freedom struggle is referred, or can be referred, or should be recognized as one of the most important milestone in the history of human rights movements in India. So, this is again a very, very important dimension of human rights movements. This is the Pigeon movements. Okay, we know that, as I said, that no movement is something that has just started today. Movements are of prolonged nature. They exist for a long period of time, and sometimes the movements are an ongoing process, okay. It's not that suppose the movement for democracy, if we talk about, it is an ongoing process, because it is a thing that will be changed according to time, according to need. So like that, movement is something that is an ongoing process. Even today, you can just see here that uh, the reference has been given of an era that is in the, you know pre-independence time or pre-independence period, 1858 and 1914. Okay, but even in today's context also, peasant movements are existent. So this peasant movement is a very, very significant move in the direction of human rights. And why this peasant movements is considered or is something that should be cited in the realm of human rights. The reason is that peasants are fighting for their economic rights. They are one of the most primary groups, okay, in our economy. If we just think about this primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector of our economy, which is the backbone, okay, of any social system, it's very important because of the agrarian nature of our social system. It's very essential to think about or to speak about the rights of the patient. And it has been in existence, or patient movements has been in existence for long. And it is almost centered on economic issues. Economic issues are very, very important. Okay? Economic issues are very, very important. And it is something, a kind of protest against the policy, okay, which takes away their rights. Okay, so that is why peasant movement is something that has been a very, very what should I say, prominent movement in the field of human rights. Okay, here you can see that Mahatma Gandhi, he was someone that, you know, he integrated all movements and put it into this freedom struggle. So that is why this picture has been put. Okay, so the next slide is about the avant-garde of human rights movement. So now what is this avant-garde? Avant-garde refers to a kind of beginning, a kind, it refers to initiation, it refers to the beginning or starting or something. So how this all started in India? We know that there was social segregation in India. Okay, there was social segregation in India. There was what should I say, prevalent gender equality. Okay, and so many other kinds of uh, stigmas, or we can say that meanings were in existence. But we find that the colonial period brought a different notion or a kind of evolution of a set of ideology, which were actually very, very, what should I say, important source for organization of movement of different sorts in India. Okay, various kinds of movements that we will discuss in our subsequent slides. So that is why the beginning or initiation of this human rights movement are based on the impact of Western ideas and philosophy, emergence of an enlightened class, social reform movement, okay, creation of a society based on the ideals of modernity, and social and spiritual emancipation. Because if you analyze, or if you just introspect into that particular period, you will find that there were so many kinds of changes. Okay, a revolution took place in the entire the field, or we can say that in all the aspects of our society. And this was something that coexisted with this colonial rule. And we find that that helped in organizing various kinds of movements. Okay, and those movements were people centric. They spoke about the people, they spoke about the rights of the people. Okay, here I would like to give the reference to we can say social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Dayanand Saraswati, Eknath Ranade, and all those social reformers. And those social reformers actually led a movement for women's rights, women's education, okay, prohibition of child marriage. They all worked, or we can say the right to women's education was bestowed upon at that period of time because of the kind of social reform movement, because of the kind of exposure that Western education provided. Whenever there is exposure, then a kind of different notions develop. There is a development in our thought. Then we try to question some of the prevalent social practices, and that exactly happened at that time. And when this kind of resistance, or we can say that social resistance was there, this social resistance ultimately helped to formulate acts to prohibit the sati and all those kinds of system. Okay, and another very important point that I would like to mention here is the social and spiritual emancipation. So earlier it was religion. Okay, religion was something that was talked about, that was spoken about, but here we find that there was again a movement to move from religion to spirituality. And that movement actually led to the secular frame of India. So these are actually very, very important, and that is why they are regarded as the avant-garde of human rights movement. Okay, so the next slide is about the creative discourse and human rights movement. Now, what are this creative discourse? These are the writings, okay? And here again, we find that movement is always not, uh, based on war, or movement is always not the kind of face to face or physical protest that is organized. Movements are also sometimes silent. Movements are also based on our ideas, the way we represent our thoughts. All these things are also part of movement. That is why this creative discourse and human rights movement point has been included here. So here you will find that I would like to cite Tagore for that matter. Because he was not a freedom fighter in the truest sense of the term, but he was a poet, he was a novelist, he was a writer, and he was acknowledged by the colonial rulers as well as uh, you know, the international society. But we find that his writings spoke about all kinds of socio-economic justice. Okay, and it also spoke about aggressive nationalism, what is the significance of nationalism, and even during the Bengal division of 1905, what kind of uh, creation he had. So these are some of the things actually which uh, compels one to believe that yeah, creative discourses has its role in you know organizing human rights movement, because they inspire. And if you see that any revolution or any movement has some discourse as its fundamental base. For example, when we talk about the communist revolution that had taken place in different parts of the world, these are based on the ideas of Marx. Marx had his discourses which inspired people. Okay, like that, these are the we can say that creative uh, personalities whose writings expose the truth of uh, Indian society at that point of time. Not only that, we also find others like Munshi Premchand, okay, whose novels always spoke about the people at the grassroots level, the people who were struggling to meet their to uh, you know to have, or they were struggling for a 3 square meal a day. We also find writers like Mulk Rajanand, who, I would say that very neatly and very uh, uh, the subtlety of his thoughts and all those things were expressed in his novels. And he spoke about the tea garden laborers, okay, the very, very indigenous people and their struggles and all that. And it is also the case with writers like Amrita Pritam, who spoke about the agony, the kind of, after math, or the kind of struggle, and we can say that the distraction of in partition. So all those novelists, all those writers, through their writings, tried to spoke about humanity, and it was a kind of a movement. If you see that their writings spoke about people, their writings spoke about the have-nots. So this is a very, very important event when we talk about human rights movement. Okay, now the next point is Indian democracy as progeny of human rights movement. As I already have entitled this particular uh, presentation, the role of democracy and civil society, so it's very pertinent to mention here about this democracy. Okay, so we know that the preamble to the Indian constitution refers it as the sovereign socialist and secular republic. Okay, and it is not something, as I said, the result of a single day. It is the result of the struggle that the people have undergone, and that is why they understood the value of sovereignty, and why this terminology socialist had been put, so that the people get economic justice, which was denied earlier. Okay, and there was also a trial to establish a secular uh, democracy because of the kind of mayhem, or we can say that communal strifes that was existent at that point of time. Okay, and even that, though I will explain it later, even now also we find that this kind of communal disharmony results into human rights violation. People are being attacked, people are being from a particular religion are being killed, and all these things happen. So ultimately, this democracy was something a result of a struggle. It was a result of a movement. And this movement is still continuing because we are trying to protect the democracy or the democratic fabric. How we can protect it? We can protect it only when the people of the nation are, you know, or their rights are being secured, we can say. They are ensured all these rights. So only then this democracy will be protected, because it is continuous, or there is a continuous trial, or there is a threat on democracy on an regular basis. So to protect that, there is again another kind of movement, okay, to secure the rights of the individual. So that is why we have to remember that this democracy itself is a result of a struggle. So another important point here is land reforms and human rights movement. Okay, we know that the agrarian structure in India was such that we had the land holding system, or we had this zamindari kind of system, where it was completely feudal in nature. Okay, and this feudal nature also is something very exploitative. Okay, and feudalism is something that establishes the or that places the rights of the powerful, okay, at the top, and the we can say that the others, those who are the at the bottom, they are denied all kinds of facilities and they are being exploited. So this has been the case in India since beginning, and we find that many such incidents where uh, people were being targeted, or they were deprived of their primary source of living. So here we find that one attempt or a movement was led by Acharya Vinoba Bhave, who was a Gandhian, and he led the Bhudan movement. Okay, and this Bhudan movement had certain objectives, like to bring about a social order based on equality of opportunities by ensuring balanced economic distribution, then decentralization of economic holdings and powers, and he also pleaded for that power should be decentralized. Okay, and uh, everyone should have the right to land and property. It is not that there will be a kind of system where a particular individual will concentrate most of the capital or the land, and the others will be deprived. That was the kind of system, because people were not educated, uh, the means were meager. So as a result, it was really very, very difficult for them to uh, survive. So this Bhudan movement is a movement in the direction of human rights, and we find that it brought phenomenal changes in the land holding system in India. So that is why it is also a landmark event in the history of human rights movement in India. Okay. Next point, I have entitled it as Rise of Proletariat Class and Human Rights Movement. So, proletariat, this terminology is something that I have borrowed, okay, from Karl Marx, and it refers to the working class people. Okay, so this is a phenomena that, as I said, that we are continuously striving for protecting the democracy. Here again, we find that the struggle continued. The Pigeon movement, as I said, that was earlier existent, it was then also, rejuvenating, because it was felt that they were not given the kind of facilities, or we can say that there was huge gap in our society. The social hierarchy was still existent, and we find that this hierarchy, the people who were at the uh, you know bottle, were not upgraded, and they were struggling. There was acute poverty, there were diseases, and there was no any kind of enlightenment in their life, and they were just continuing with that kind of suffering. So during the 1960s and 70s, we find that there has been a kind of struggle which is known as Nakshal movements, and it originally started in West Bengal, and then it spreaded slowly and steadily to other parts in the southern region of India also. And this was a movement actually that was a movement of the working class. The main motive was to protect the rights of the working class, to grant them equality, to make them equal. So this is again a very, very important phase of human rights movement in India, and that also we find that ultimately it resulted into a denial of human rights. Maybe on many literatures it's there that the emergency that India had witnessed during the 1975 and 77, this is known as a black phase or a dark phase in the history of Indian democracy, where the rights of the press and other rights were being completely withdrawn. So this has something to do, means how people fought the movement. So this is what exactly the working class movement is, and it contributed phenomenally to ensure rights to the people belonging to the working class. Next important point, as I said, that this I will deal separately. It is the communalism and human rights movement. Yeah, this is a very interesting thing. We know that in Indian context, religion is something that has been a matter of concern, or we can say that it's a source of conflict or rift in our society. And it was something that was uh, somewhat germinated among the people by the colonial rulers, and it continued in a very very uh, destructive manner, in a very very ugly way. And we find that this communal feeling, that feeling of religious superiority and intolerance, has created violence in our society, a violent society. And there has been, here you can see many riots, prominent riots have been pointed out. This has resulted into massive human rights violation, and this is again a continuous what should I say, stigma in our society. Even till date we could not come out of those religious narrowness or parochialism, that will be, or that is a better term to explain this. So we have seen many riots, and what has been the consequence? The consequence has been denial of the rights. Okay, children are being targeted, women are being targeted, and there is complete destruction of property and all that. And it is something, a very very serious threat to human rights. And there has been a parallel movement also for removing communalism from society. There has been trial. Okay, there has been movement. The role of media is very very significant, role of education is very very significant. So these are the things that really are important in the field of human rights movement. Next one is conflict, counterinsurgency, and human rights movement. Okay, so this is something again a very very pertinent, a very very relevant issue, and it is centered towards the Armed Force Special Power Act, because insurgency is a kind of civil war that is fought between the government and the people. Okay, and this has been at the beginning, as I said, that India is a diverse land, and sometimes, there is a rift, there is a conflict, and that conflict was prevalent in India since independence, because many of the states, or we can say that many of the ethnic communities, were a bit reluctant to be a part of the Indian Union. Okay, because of the kind of uh, difference in the social scenario or social structure. Okay, because here I would like to cite that most of the tribal society don't have any caste system. Okay, they maintain an equilibrium and all that, so that is why they were a bit hesitant. But they became a part of India, and soon after that, there were demands for self determination and all that, that happened in the northeastern region, and even we find that in Kashmir also these things happened. So as a result, this Armed Force Special Power Act was implemented, and it gave enormous power to the army, or to the our officials in the Indian army, or the entire force, you know, to take up weapons, and to, you know, target people and all that. And it is alleged that this FSPA has been misused in the areas where it is functioning, or it was sorry, it was implemented. So here again we find that how this conflict, counterinsurgency, and human rights movements are important. A very very glaring example of that is Irom Sharmila, who had been fasting to remove this FSPA, and her contribution as a human rights activist is phenomenal. And where this thing we find is that the human rights activism actually born out of such kind of a draconian rule means this Armed Force Special Power Act is considered something uh, against the spirit of basic human rights, because here people are not allowed to move freely. There are restrictions, then there is sometimes misuse of power. So as a result, it has resulted into a kind of human rights activism, and this activism actually has helped to shape human rights and or human rights movement in such a manner that uh, uh, it has been recognized globally. The kind of human rights movement that uh, uh, we are having in India, it recognized or it got a global recognition because of the kinds of activism that was involved or shown by people, or uh, the kind of spirit that was shown by lady like Iram Sharmila. Okay. Now the next slide is about civil society and human rights movement. So what is the civil society? Civil society refers to groups, individuals, okay, and organization that fight for people's right, that fight for public interest. And this civil society has been a very, very important uh, or predominant force as far as human rights movement are concerned. In the last 2-3 decades, we have seen that how the civil society groups have organized themselves and have been fighting for various social causes or for protecting the rights of the people. And this kind of protests are peaceful, and they negotiate with the government. And another important thing is that the very, very one of the very important and prominent movement that was led by the civil society group has been the anti-corruption movement led by Anna Hazare. So this civil society movement, this example I have given you because uh, you know all these things or instances we cannot use in a single class. But one thing we have to remember that it is not the sole movement. There have been so many other movements led by the civil society group that speaks about the protection of people, that speaks about the health condition, or the protect for securing the health rights, the child rights, okay, and all such kind of aspects are being covered by the civil society groups. Okay, this is again a very, very important, we can say that movement in the, or that is a very, very kind of important movement in the entire what should I say, that narrative of human rights movement. Uh, it has a different kind of feature. Okay, personality, this term may not be appropriate. It has a distinct identity or feature. It refers to the kind of struggle that has been led by the socially vulnerable group. And in India, we find that these movements are something very, very pertinent, very, very important, because the people from that particular group are being targeted. They are being targeted, they are being denied the basic rights, and they are subjected to various kinds of humiliation. There are instances, there are evidences where the Dalit have been targeted, or they are being put into innumerable kind of torture. So this Dalit movement is again a very, very significant step in the direction of human rights, or human rights strengthening human rights movement, because this group of people are somewhat, they are socially excluded, and there is a continuous denial of their rights, and they are somewhere considered as people not belonging to a particular social group. So that is why this movement is again a very, very significant movement. Okay, next one is displacement induced movement. So displacement has been also one of the very very important and relevant human rights and humanitarian challenges, as people are being displaced, or they are forced to move from their native place. The reasons may be varied. Okay, it may be the political division that may compel people to move to other places. It may be the conflict, it may be the natural disaster, but this kind of displacement has ushered into an era of identity crisis. Okay, and it's a denial of basic fundamental rights. Okay, that are being required for a life with dignity. Why it is the denial of the basic fundamental rights? The reason is that the people who are being displaced and who take shelter to other parts, or in other nation, they are denied some of the basic rights. Okay, basic fundamental rights like right to vote, then citizenship rights, and all those, they are being denied the basic rights. And this has given rise to the controversial, or the controversy around the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Registration of Citizens. So this is something, a very very pertinent point, where we find that there is a continuous movement. Okay, maybe sometimes for securing their rights, and these movements have also uh, has implication for human rights. Okay, and some of the displacements are related to the development related projects, where due to the development projects, people are it is mostly the case with uh, tribal population, they are forced to leave their places. Okay, and there is a very little trial on the part of the state for their rehabilitation. So this has also resulted into a kind of movement. That is why it is known as displacement induced movement. So ecological movements, this is again a kind of human rights, because it is trying to protect the nature, and nature is something essential for the survival of humans. Okay, it is very very essential for the survival of humans. So here we find that there are so many ecological movements that have taken place from time to time, like Narmada Bachao Andolan, Vaishnoi movement, Chipko movement, okay, Silent Valley movement. So these are the movement, okay, which were centered around the nature, but they were the movements led for the protection of the environment, because to live in a healthy environment is also a human right. So that is why this ecological movements are also part of human rights movement. Okay, movement for social inclusion. So I think in your brochure also you have seen the some of the images that speaks about the our uh, differentiation, that speaks about human diversity. Okay, because nature has not made everybody similar. There is difference, there is some kind of different abilities, and the people who are having certain different abilities, there has always been a denial of their rights. They are denied of the right to education, they are denied access to educational institutions. Then there is also denial as far as their entry into the employment sector is concerned, and these kind of things are very very prevalent. Okay, so and they have to suffer or undergo a kind of social humiliation too. So it is something, a torture, it is something, a mental agony, which is ultimately a human rights violation. So there has always been a trial on the part of the stakeholders, okay, or different civil society activists. uh, their movement has ultimately resulted into the formation of different acts, not only at the global level but also in India. We find that Rights of Persons with Disabilities Acts 1995 and 2016 that directs the state that what are the facilities that should be granted to the people who are differently able, and not only that, how to secure their rights and how to include them in the social sector has been stressed. And this has not been, and these acts have not been formulated in a single day. It is the result of so many struggles of stakeholders from different uh, sectors. Okay. Next one is movement for gender space and equality. So why I have given this name movement for gender space and equality, the reason is that what this gender space refers. We know that gender has different connotations, it has different dimension. It doesn't only refer to the male and female, okay? It also refers to other genders too. Okay, and this gender diversity in India has received a different kind of impetus in the recent times. Okay, we find that there have been movements, okay, during the 70s and 80s for against dowry in India. Okay, and there has been movement for domestic violence. Peoples and groups are being fighting. There has been movement to secure the rights of women from religious minorities. Okay, this triple talaq law is something, a step in this regard. Okay, and another important thing is the movement that has been uh, led, and this is a revolution rather, I would say, that was for women's protection in India. Okay, that happened after the uh, Nirbhaya case. And not only that, we also have rights of persons belonging to transgender communities, and that has also been the result of a struggle, a movement, because of the fact that this transgender population, okay, this transgender population have been also historically targeted. They are the group who were denied the basic amenities of life like education, health, and they were isolated, and they were being, a matter of what should I say, that they were somewhat looked down upon. Okay, and this act for transgender that was that came up in 2019 also gave them all kinds of rights, and they also can participate in different walks of life, including employment, education, and health. So this is very important, that breaking this stereotyping. So it's the human rights movement that is breaking the stereotyping from our society. And the last one in this slide is the omission of section 377 of Indian Penal Code. Okay, and it is also the result of a relentless struggle, the struggle led by the LGBTQ community, the queer identity. It's very important, okay, to secure their rights, because they are also vulnerable. They're also vulnerable because of their identity or the kind of natural distinctions they have. And these are the result of the struggle led by people for securing their rights. So, all this speaks volume about the human rights movement as far as gender space and equality is concerned. Okay. Now we have almost come to the end of our lecture. So here we would try to understand what has been the state's responses. Okay, we know that the states are mandated to preserve and promote human rights. Okay, including the right to social security and all such kind of thing. But sometimes we find that there is a kind of contradiction. Okay, contradiction in the sense that some of the policies are dubious in nature. Dubious in the nature means that they might not be that much people's friendly, as for example this displacement, because there are so many examples where, because of the government's projects or government recognized or sanctioned projects also, we find that this kind of problems are arousing. And there is always, or sometimes there is a conflict between the citizens and the government regarding the issues of citizenship and those kinds of policies and various other kinds of bills and all that. So, what has been the state's response? If the state is democratic in its ideal or in its attitude, then the response will be positive. But if the state is something that doesn't consider democracy as its source or as something very important, then the struggle or rift starts. So now there are certain present concerns and challenges that we find in the field of human rights movement. These are the kind of social discrimination that is still prevalent. Though we have spoken about Dalit movements, we have spoken about the inclusion of the persons with disabilities. These are still the gray areas. We find that women from Dalit communities are being targeted, they are being tortured, and even sometimes they are being uh, murdered also. So this is something, an area where human rights movement should continue its march. Even in the case of disabled or differently able persons, the right to inclusion is very, very important, and that needs to be taken care of. Employment and education, here again we find that uh, there is a huge demand that equality of access should be there. Okay, and class and caste, both the factors should be considered as far as employment and education is concerned, and there we should strive for that, or human rights should go in that direction. Displacement of the dependents means that displacement uh, regarding dependence as well as displacement related insecurity is something for which we should work. Okay, because we know that there are places like detention camps, there are places like refugee camps where people uh, cannot live a healthy life. So we should, or the entire human rights activism should be focused on that. And marginalization of citizens should be reduced. People should be given more and more power, and they should be empowered in one sense. So these are some of the concerns that needs to be taken up in the by the human rights movement. So at the end, we can say that human rights are the prerequisites. These are the uh, basic condition, okay, in all civilization for all individual, irrespective of our gender, our identity, our culture, our language. It is equal for all. It is equally important for all. So there is a need, okay, always on the part of the state as well as on the part of the individuals to remain enlightened and to fight for protection of human rights, not only for the rights of uh, the individual but for the rights of the uh, human civilization or the people in a particular group or the society at large. It's very important because there is always a tendency of concentration of power. There is always a fight or a conflict for the basic preconditions of life. So, those tendencies should be reduced. And how these tendencies can be reduced? It can be reduced only when we orient people, orientation of people towards the goals of human rights and basic values is very, very important. And there, I think, should be an attempt, or the human rights movement should be directed to the reorientation of the minds of individual so that they can have their own development as well as the development of others. And there should be peaceful coexistence. The idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam that we, our ancient scriptures and uh, has highlighted, that can be only realized when we have all other conditions fulfilled. So that is why the role of education, formal, informal education, is very, very significant. We need to think about or think out of the box. We need to think about that the other than the theoretical nature of education, a system which can really enlighten people, which can really make conscious efforts to organize movement based on the ideals of human rights. So with this, I conclude my lecture on human rights movements, contemplating the role of democratic state and civil society. I hope the lecture is useful for all of you. Thank you.